freelance journalism in the age of AI. My name is Abigail Edge, and I'm an independent journalist and consultant. I'm also a co-founder of the Society of Freelance Journalists. So this year in Perugia, there have been a lot of sessions on AI. Thank you very much for making it along to this one. We're hoping to do something a little bit different today because a lot of the conversation so far has focused on newsrooms and how large organizations can harness the power of AI for their businesses. What we're looking at today is how can solopreneurs and independent journalists use AI to be more productive, to save their creative energy, to get boring admin out of the way, and hopefully leave you with some really practical tips and tools. So today with me, I've got three fantastic panelists who I will let introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Anna Codrea-Rado. Like many freelance journalists, I wear different hats. So I do traditional journalism, have bylines in various publications. I also write my own newsletter. I'm heavily involved in various freelance organizations, helping freelance journalists, but also other freelancers from the creative industries work for better pay conditions. I also do various what I call commercial work, so working with marketing departments, which is essentially how I fund my freelance journalism. And I think all of those hats are probably applicable to the conversation today.
Hi everyone, I'm Nikita Roy. I am currently a Knight Fellow at the International Center for Journalists, where a lot of my work this year is focusing on AI literacy in the news industry. I'm also the founder of Newsroom Robots, a venture incubated at Harvard Innovation Labs, which focuses on AI training and advisory services for journalism organizations. Part of that, I also host a podcast called Newsroom Robots and a newsletter focusing on how the news industry is using AI. And I'm also currently leading the AI Journalism Lab over at the City University of New York.
And I'm Chris Stokel-Walker, and like everybody on this panel, I think we have a portfolio career of all sorts of different things. So I'm journalist, lecturer at Newcastle University, author, have a book out on AI called How AI Ate the World, coming in 3 weeks, and basically trying to make a living out of all these different things that are quite difficult to slot together into a single jigsaw.
Great, so I'd like to start with a question for the audience, actually. I'd like to know how many of you in the room here today are freelance journalists? Just give me a little wave. Great. And how many of you are worried that the work that you do might one day be replaced by AI? Give me a little wave. Great. I think that is the question on a lot of people's lips at the moment. And I think Anna has an interesting story to share about her experience with that.
So I'll preface this with this story happened outside of journalism. So even though I was hired in for this freelance gig because I'm a journalist and was very reliant on my journalistic skills, this happened outside of a traditional media organization, outside of a newsroom. But I was hired to work on a newsletter. So one of my specialisms is newsletter writing. I was hired to work on a newsletter which was it curated links from articles with a little blurb about each one, and then the link. And we did a couple of issues of the newsletter, and then the person that I was working for was a client because it was a freelance gig. They said, I think we could probably use AI to help with this. But don't worry, this is going to be great because it's going to free you up to do bigger projects, and we're going to be able to get you to do some longer reported pieces and really use your journalism skills. And I actually did kind of watch as the AI systems were being implemented, and I was actually able to see kind of like what that actually looks like. But lo and behold, the budgets changed, and not only did the longer and more in-depth pieces not come to anything, I also was replaced by the robot. So it was my first experience of kind of like living, I suppose, this thing that a lot of people are worried about happening, which is having a job quite literally be taken by the robot. But on the other hand, I suppose to kind of just like put more positive spin on it, this isn't the first time that technology has in some way impacted a job loss for me. I've actually went freelance because of redundancy, which was during a pivot to video. So, these things do happen. But yeah, a robot took my job.
I think that could be the title of your next book, Anna. I think that story really just highlights how fast the industry is moving at the moment and how important it is for us as freelancers to keep on top of the new skills needed for that. So again, I have another question for you in the audience. How many of you are using ChatGPT or similar language learning models at the moment? Give me a little wave. About half of you. Interesting. And how many of you are using paid-for versions? Interesting. So, Nikita, what are the key differences between the free and premium versions of some of these tools, and what makes one specifically better than the other?
So when you're talking about generative AI tools, this is something that really came about ChatGPT in November 2022, and we are now in 2024, and there's been so much development that's happened. ChatGPT Plus came out with a more foundational model called GPT-4, a more advanced model, and that is capable of doing way more activities that you're able to do than the free version. So you can now upload an entire PDF to start chatting with it in ChatGPT Plus. I'm specifically talking about ChatGPT over here. You're able to now use it to analyze data. You can write a lot of code, put up your entire CSV files up there, ask it to create charts for you and figure out different patterns in the data just by plain language. And in the back end, you can actually see it's writing all of the code. That's something, as I'm trained as a data scientist, that I would be writing in code to analyze the data. And it does all of that work quickly, and it's able to generate all of that. It also has the feature to plug into third-party apps. So now you can, with just a line of telling it and describing your work, and if you want to create a workflow chart, you want to create a diagram, just copy paste data into it and tell it to create a bar chart, it can do that. And it's something that instead of going to Excel where you had to create a chart or going to Canva to create some sort of like flow chart, you can just put it all in a prompt and it's able to do that. And one of the fourth part about ChatGPT Plus specifically that's exciting now is that you're able to create custom bots that are just for you in plain language. Again, do you want a chatbot that takes an entire article and then converts that into a tweet or into an Instagram post? You can train it to just do that with a specific bot. So now all you'll have to do is create a custom GPT that takes your article, converts it into a tweet, and it's so simple to do it with just plain language. And so there are so many different features that's different from what is there in ChatGPT free version. And really, if you're using ChatGPT free version, it's November 2022, which is honestly Stone Age, I would say, in the AI world.
Chris, let's come to you. So I know that you're very prolific as a journalist, and you've told me that you don't sleep very much. It might be something to do with that. But I know that you've also developed some really clever strategies for using AI to be a bit more productive with your work and save time. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've tried. It's difficult because I did try, as Nikita says, the paid version of ChatGPT, GPT Plus. I pay £20 a month or whatever it is now, partly because it's a business expense and partly because I think it's good to be able to use that tech if you're reporting on it and to actually kind of figure out what the limitations and what the benefits are. And I did try the GPT store and actually setting up my own GPT of a kind of journalist in the style of my own writing and things like that, and wasn't hugely successful in terms of all of that. But there are ways that I think it can be used, and I think it's we all know that the media industry is incredibly difficult, and we know, unfortunately, that freelancers have to often bear the brunt of kind of the worst bits of it, and so it's kind of beholden on us to try and learn these things and figure out any way possible. But I couldn't get it, for instance, to develop pitches and things like that in the way that I wanted. So I often will pitch New Scientist every week, a bunch of stories based on academic research that comes out, basically trying to get it to do my job of scanning through the archive, which is a preprint server of papers, or looking at various journals and things like that, trying to understand what I would be interested in, the sorts of things I would pitch, and then actually doing that. And I thought it was brilliant the first time I tried it, but then came up against the realization that actually all of it was hallucination. So it was suggesting me 5 or so papers that would be brilliant, I asked it to give me the links. It couldn't. I then tried to research it and find it myself. Couldn't, and that's kind of one of the issues of these things. So that wasn't hugely successful, but there are other ways that you can use it in terms of maybe research, maybe some of the more grunt work that we don't really like to do.
Yeah, I just want to jump in that point actually when you're talking about understanding the limitations of what it is and the hallucinations that occur. It's fundamental for us as journalists to understand how this technology works and at its core what generative AI is doing. And at its core, it's just a probability machine. It's predicting what the next word is. It's trained on a ton of data. So yes, it makes up it can speak like a journalist. It can create all of these links because the way it knows, but it's really just predicting the next word. And I call these large language models, they are language generators. They are not knowledge generators, and they're not necessarily generating knowledge. And so there are certain ways it's really good to use it. Great to use it for helping you to edit, if you're like trying to brainstorm with it, think creatively. But certain places where the knowledge aspect of like using it as Google, it is not a search engine. So do not ask it any questions you will ask as Google. There are other tools for it. There's something called Perplexity. There is Google Gemini if it's connected to the internet. That's one aspect. There's also Microsoft Bing Chat when it's connected to the internet. That can help. But again, those hallucinations always occur with generative AI, and it's so important to fact check everything as a journalist. And that's one of the main reasons you don't see right now newsrooms deploying generative AI tools to users because of those risks of hallucinations. And that's something we haven't figured out yet.
And that's one of the key things, I think, for all of you who didn't put your hands up when we asked, have you used it? You really should try it, because it's important that you know not just how it does work, but also how it doesn't work, because ultimately there will come a time probably when we are going to be using these things in our workflows. And if you use them incorrectly, then suddenly that becomes a massive, massive issue.
So Anna, you wrote a piece last year for Business Insider about how you're essentially using Google Bard as an intern. Sounds kind of like a dream, doesn't it? Can you get it to bring you tea, or is it just more mundane tasks?
I wish. And just to kind of, I suppose it's a point on how quickly this stuff is moving, because when I wrote that piece, it was called Google Bard. I think it's now called Google Gemini. And, anyway. But I think the way I approach using these tools is more, I think of using the chatbots as interns, because they can do some stuff, but they still really need to be supervised, and they can't be completely let loose on any of your work. But a key thing that, as any freelance journalist or anyone who freelances knows, that you are all parts of the business. You are both the CEO and the HR department and the head of finance, and also the writer and the journalist, and you're all of it. And any way that I can alleviate some of the more, frankly, some of the kind of more boring but necessary tasks, that I think is where AI can really come into its own. And also, I know what we're talking about here is ChatGPT, generative AI, kind of that. These are all the buzzwords, but AI has been around for a very long time in various forms, and I have actually been using AI, predating this whole conversation, in the form of transcription software. So most journalists know about Otter.ai. It's a voice-to-text recognition transcribing software. It's AI powered. That I think that is probably the most powerful AI tool that I continue to use. I actually find it more useful than I do any of the chatbots. So we'll get into how I use them as well. But that's probably been, that to me is one piece of technology where I can actually quantify the amount of time I have saved, because in the past I would have to manually record an interview and then record an interview on a dictaphone and then manually transcribe that, and that is hours of time. Otter is doing that in real time as the recording happens, and now is able to also provide summaries and all of that kind of thing. But some of the ways that I'm using AI tools, they are kind of almost in sort of like a business support function. And one way that I have used it recently, which is not actually in the article because I figured out afterwards, is I actually put a contract that I received for a piece of freelance work into Google Bard or Google Gemini, and asked it to translate the legalese into plain English. And I asked it specifically, can you point out any ways in which this contract might not be favourable to me as the signatory on it? And it was able to point that out. Of course, I still have to go, you still have to, of course, go back and actually double check if what it's saying is correct and it isn't kind of, getting something wrong. And it was able to point out those terms. It was around kind of the use of my IP. And I then asked it to produce an email pushing back on those terms, which it did. I used that as the basis of the email to send to the contact at that company, and I actually successfully had those terms changed. And I think what's really interesting about that example is, as a freelance journalist, I would have never hired a lawyer to look over that kind of contract, and so that's kind of opening up. It's kind of giving that sort of access that I otherwise wouldn't have. And it's something that is kind of very specific to the challenges that you face as a solopreneur, kind of one-person shop. And yeah, I think it can be really helpful in those business support services. Many examples that I could go on about. But in terms of actually using it, I absolutely do not use it to kind of, if I get an assignment, I don't plug the assignment in and say, write this article for me. I use it more in the kind of all of the bits around it, and very much try to sort of focus on how can I make this, make me more efficient, essentially.
So I want to talk a little bit about prompts, because I think for a lot of people, actually getting to grips with these language learning models is a bit tricky when it comes to actually getting the information that you want. Chris has talked about hallucinations. You've talked about fine-tuning the way that you're using it to get the information that you want. I'm interested, particularly with these contracts. Did you copy and paste them verbatim? Did you block out any information? What kind of prompts did you use to actually get the result that you wanted?
So don't do what I did and don't copy it verbatim. And because with a contract, it's kind of okay, because generally with most contracts, they say up top, we will use the company in place of the actual name of the company. So take the name of the company out, because I actually did subsequently work on a story about this use case, and I spoke to a lawyer who said, that's all fine, that's great, just be careful how much information you put in, because you could technically be in breach of that company's own kind of like terms of service and all of that kind of stuff. So I would say in those kinds of situations, it's more about sort of pasting in sort of specific bits and kind of redacting any company's names and that sort of thing. But my prompt was just simply translate this from legalese into plain English. And in general, I mean, there is a bit of, we're in a really interesting point, because we are kind of figuring this stuff out, and inevitably we are going to be making mistakes. I have already made several myself. But it's about, trying to strike that balance between understanding how these tools work, exactly as Chris said. They are coming, and you need to understand how they work. To go back to my example of the robot taking my job, the silver lining of that is that I watched exactly how that happened. So now I will be able to spot it happening in the future. And they're also thinking kind of 3 steps ahead. I now understand, there's potentially a job in being a robot whisperer, teaching, going into a company and offering a service where I can sell a service where I'm showing a company how to use the AI. So it's about but you have to understand how these tools work, and there is that balance of using them, and the only way you're going to figure out how they work is by using them, and then also being very mindful of the ethics and the pitfalls and all of that. And it's just we're on that tightrope at the moment.
Thank you. Nikita, I know a lot of the work that you're doing with the workshops at CUNY and various other places are based around teaching journalists in newsrooms primarily to use GPT and other models. But in terms of getting the prompts right, is there any art to it? What kind of tips do you have for the audience to get to grips with that?
Yeah, there's like a whole framework that usually I teach, and there are 3 main things, first of all, when you're writing a prompt. And one of the first things is you start off with giving them a bit of a persona of who they are. Again, these large language models, they are trained on everything that's there on the internet. They are really huge models. And so when you give them a context about who they are, so act as a journalist. Over in her case, you're going to tell them to act as a lawyer who is reviewing contracts. So you'll be more specific. And the second part is give them a bit of context. So give them the context about who you are. You are a journalist who is a freelance journalist. You're getting into a contract for this particular article with this company, and you want them to review it. So instead of just asking them to review it as well, the third point to every prompt is an output criteria that you ask it. So get it to be more specific. So ask it to look at the contract and give you all of the different parts in the contract that could be possibly something that that's not so good and that you would want to negotiate, and ask it maybe why it would not be, what are the alternatives that you could suggest. So you're kind of giving it this sort of like output criteria. The same way is for everything else. If you're trying to like generate a headline, generate a summary, telling it how long or short, how many words do you want it to be, what the tone, the style of the voice should be, all of those are different things that you ask it to do in a prompt. And try expanding to make these prompts more than just a sentence. It's okay to have like a chat with them, but a lot of what I do with using ChatGPT, and especially if I'm doing like reviewing a contract, all of those kinds of tasks, is they're actually quite long. And I'm very detailed and thorough, and then keep having a conversation with it and go back and forth, because use it as a brainstorming companion. That's what it is. It's somebody with whom you has a bunch of knowledge, who's read a bunch of stuff, can make some stuff up sometimes. And also you said it's an intern. I call it an insecure intern because it does not sometimes want to tell you when it's wrong. And so that's one part that you need to keep in mind. But as long as you think of it as an insecure intern that is extremely trained on a lot of stuff, that's the way that you should have a relationship in terms of like understanding how you can chat and prompt it. But those are the three things that I usually talk about: is a persona, the context about, and then put in an output criteria.
And presumably you should be fact-checking content that you get the same as you would from any other resource that you're using for journalism, right?
Absolutely, exactly. Everything that you get, you fact check it. You get your primary, your secondary sources, and then only then can you say that that's a fact. Again, all of these are not generating knowledge. Even if you use any tools like Perplexity, Gemini, Bard, which are connected to the internet, it's not necessarily going to be true all the time, because what they're doing over here is finding websites, scraping them, summarizing it, and putting that as an answer. From time to time, they can, again, misunderstand stuff and make things up.
Mm-hmm. So sorry, Chris, do you have something to add?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I don't know, this technology moves so quickly, but I remember writing a story for New Scientist, because part of the issue with LLMs is their context window has become bigger, right? But they still do struggle to handle long things. And so one thing that I found success with is actually, to use Nikita's kind of example of an insecure intern, they don't take things that you might assume are given when you're giving them a sort of a prompt or a task to do. So you do need to kind of spell it out. And one of the key ways that early prompt engineers kind of found a way to supercharge the performance of these models was to ask them to think step by step. So actually go through and say, so rather than I have an interview transcript, can you pick out the 8 key points that should be from that? Instead, you need to say, I have given you an interview transcript. You are a world expert summarizer. Read the interview transcript, full stop. Digest what is said in it, full stop. Analyze what are the key points, full stop, and then produce things. And I don't know whether that's still the case now, because obviously these things move so much, but that previously was, I think, at least one way that works.
It is still the chain, like the different chain of thought prompting. There's so many different techniques of prompting, and if you're doing something more complex, that's definitely a way to go. That's the chatting back and forth with the model that you can do. But if you're usually just doing like a quick, I would say your first intro prompt, always set in like the context. Give it the persona and give it the output criteria, and then you go back and forth with it. Don't expect to have everything ready in your the output that you get from it. That's not always going to be perfect. That's something that requires editing, and you keep on going back and forth with the model throughout that process.
I want to talk a little bit about the different types of work that we as freelance journalists do? I know between the four of us, we do a mixture of journalism, content production, consulting, newsletter, teaching as well. How might you use AI tools or learning language models for those different types of work? Is there any kind of difference in the way that you would use them? Chris, let's hear from you.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I find really useful is kind of harnessing, you put together these different tools to try and benefit. And I wouldn't use it in journalism practice because that is much more high stakes, and frankly, you never want to get anything wrong and you need to double check these things. But, you know, the reality of any freelance journalist career nowadays, unless you are maybe one of a dozen people worldwide in the whole industry, is you're probably going to be doing some sort of commercial work. So I will occasionally do commercial work where I am covering events, and you know, they're hour-long events, multiple hour-long events. They go on for days, and you're expected to kind of turn around a report summarising what happened in that process. And there is a useful kind of cycle that I go through where I will put the interview transcript into Otter, or get it from Otter, sorry, and then put it into an LLM like ChatGPT or Claude and get it to kind of summarise the key points. And you know, this is where I think the idea of journalism being an art, not a science, kind of comes head on with these LLMs, which are very much scientific based and just guessing essentially the next most likely word to please you. But you know, they're able to do a passable job of summarising stuff in a non-journalistic way. I think where it starts to get particularly tricky and the use of it becomes much more difficult for journalism is that idea of like having a nose for the news, and you can't really, you know, sometimes you can't even teach that. We find that very difficult to do at my university. So like knowing how to do that is kind of one way of doing it.
And just to be very clear, we're talking here about using AI tools to summarise articles and do research rather than actually produce content from scratch. Which is problematic for many reasons. Chris mentioned Otter, and I wanted to move on now to talk about some AI tools that are not necessarily learning language models, but things that can streamline your workflow and just make your day-to-day work a little bit easier as a freelancer. Anna, I think you have a bunch of those up your sleeve.
I mean, honestly, I think Otter is my absolute favourite, and yes, there are some safety concerns with that. I know there were stories. There was some stories a few years ago. I think I would be careful about putting super sensitive interviews in it. But I feel for the most part very comfortable using it. Just the nature of what I do. But I know that there are, like with anything, of course, there's always security risks and things that you need to be aware of when using any kind of tech tools. But I would say Otter is the most. Like I said, the one that's made the material difference. The tool I've been playing with but I kind of go back and forth on, I think it's called Motion. And it is essentially, it's a time management, AI-powered time management tool. So you hook up all of your different kind of, all of your calendars, and I think your inbox, and kind of like all of your different tools, you hook it up to it. And it's supposed to essentially figure out what the best schedule for you. So if you've got multiple deadlines, multiple clients, which is, you know, that's the freelance life, it will produce a calendar for you telling you which things you need to do by when. In theory, it sounds very good, and I do want to continue playing with it, and I do think it probably has applications. I think for me, when in the particular moment I tried to use it was when I just had conflicting deadlines, and there were just not enough hours in the day to, doesn't matter how I carved them up, it just simply didn't, the time blocking just didn't work. But I think those tools can be really powerful. All of these sort of anything that you can automate things, even just as simple as, I don't even know if this doesn't even really count as AI, but you know, I use bookkeeping software and it has an automatic reminder when an invoice is late. You know, is that going to sort of necessarily mean that you're never going to have a late invoice paid? No, but it can be really helpful just to kind of outsource some of that repetitive work. Also, just in general, I find that I think there's kind of like two big buckets that the tools that I use fall into. One is in this, like I said, this business support service, but then the other is also in this, it sounds so, I'm going to embarrass myself saying this, but the other is in also kind of like the emotional and sort of loneliness aspect of freelancing. So I often will just sort of chat with the model, just to get a bit of kind of positive feedback on my story. So, you know, I'll kind of basically ask it, like, does this make sense? Because by and large, it's so much friendlier than an editor. It's going to say, like, yes, Anna, this is really well written. And, like, your point here was very clear. This part could use improvement. And actually, it's like, you know what, that's really nice to hear. Thank you very much. Yeah, and there's just, I think in general, I think it's really about finding the tools that work for you, in the sense that what is actually going to work better for you? Is it kind of be like a very calendar-based system, or actually, you know, maybe you're going to be more, I know there are lots of writers who get very particular about what writing platform they use. And I think everyone's going to have their kind of quirks, but it's also about, it's kind of about playing around with these things and not being cautiously optimistic with them. But I think by and large, there are some really fantastic tools out there that I think really will make a lot of difference essentially on the business side of the freelancing and on that administrative side. I think that's where they have their most power. Yeah.
If only there was an AI tool for those unpaid invoices, right? On the note of Motion, I've also used that. It's quite spendy. Reclaim.ai I found was a good alternative to that. It's much, much cheaper. Nikita, I wanted to come over to you because I know that in addition to everything else that you do, your Newsroom Robots podcast is hugely popular, and there's a range of different tools that you use to get that out. It's a couple of times a month, isn't it?
So I've spoken a lot about it on the podcast as well in terms of how we've been using AI. Motion is also another tool that keeps me on time everywhere and manage my projects. But apart from that, I think really it's the research aspect of the job that we do that's really where I also find AI is really helpful. So when I talk about that, one thing that's really helpful is you can chat with YouTube videos now. So if you go onto Google Gemini, you can do @YouTube, paste in a link over there, and just sit and chat with it. That's really helpful for me, especially when I am going to be interviewing. A lot of my guests are well known in the industry, and they have done multiple talks, maybe on AI, maybe on books that they have written, and I just want to get an idea in terms of like what their talking points are, how conversations are, and what are the gaps in where what they haven't spoken about yet right now. So I usually put in those talks. Sometimes they're like really long, and I'm not able to like sit through like 10 talks that they have done. I will just summarize them and then get an insights of what they are. That also helps me for a lot of like press conferences that AI companies are doing. They're doing a lot of these summits right now and talking about all of the advancements they're doing. I need to keep on top of all the advancements that are happening on AI, but I don't have the time to sit and look at everything. I just put that into YouTube and then get it to summarize it for me. So that's one tool. Another tool that I quite often use again is it's called Perplexity that I've been mentioning. It's a tool. It's a generative AI search tool. So that's again connected to the internet, and it can produce summaries based on a bunch of different websites that it has visited and read, and then it summarizes that over there. And so that's another tool called Perplexity that I often use. And in all of this, really, where it comes down to, we've talking a lot about ChatGPT. There's another really good tool called Claude, Claude, that I use now for the writing purposes of AI. Really, I think it has a bit more natural tone to it. It gives me a lot of feedback over there. So again, we also put out a newsletter, and now everything that we do, I just like get it to run through it. And I do a lot of things about seeing whether this makes sense, because sometimes I'm talking about a bit technical concepts, and not everybody who's listening to it is on the technical side of the podcast. And so I'm just trying to understand, is this too complex? There was a podcast about AI agents, and this is like a big topic. And I went around multiple times to see, am I explaining this properly? Like, what would somebody who doesn't understand AI think about it? And then try to dumb it down a bit. Try to get analogies maybe that you could like explain things to people with. So again, those kind of like brainstorming companions, that's where I find it extremely helpful. But all to say, in all of these different tools, it's that human input that's coming in. You're understanding, you're thinking, what are the different questions that you're thinking about? And then going in, getting these tools to help you with all of these like supplementary work that's there.
Chris, how about yourself? Any AI tools that you're using that haven't been mentioned already?
They've all largely been mentioned. I mean, I have a kind of Otter to Claude / ChatGPT process. And one thing that I'll often do sometimes, this is less for the freelancing side, and you wouldn't want to necessarily do this, but like for the lecturing side, or if you're doing any presentations, I use DALL-E, which is kind of built into ChatGPT Plus for just like clip art. I don't use it for, there's a whole box of worms that we could open up about kind of, and we probably would have to have like 10 more panel discussions about kind of the copyright and ownership and things, that we should absolutely be aware that these things are extractive technologies that are ultimately not paying us for the training data that we're giving them. But for something like making my slides more interesting as a lecturer, I use that, and it's not necessarily going to be something that you use day in, day out for journalism, but it could be, you use it more as a brainstorming tool for a logo, or you use it for your kind of brand design or something like that. As long as you're still paying somebody at the end of it, an artist, to actually do the finished product, because I think that is the key thing. And as freelancers, we all know the value of our work, and I think that's the kind of crucial thing. But yeah, largely otherwise, it's all the same tools that we've mentioned before.
You mentioned you've got an Otter to Claude to GPT workflow.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
So that, again, it's not the journalism stuff. It's more, it's kind of a little bit like what Nikita was saying in terms of if there's a lot of research that I want to do, and I found that you get to a point in, or at least I have in my freelance career, where you're it's like that scene from the Charlie Chaplin film Modern Life, I think it is, where he's working on like the factory floor of a nut factory, is frantically trying to like tighten these nuts, and it all gets away and it gets away and it gets away, and the more that you're trying to spin those plates, the more difficult it becomes. So rather than plowing through 10 hours of YouTube videos of someone talking, doing the same sort of thing of mine is slightly less advanced because we don't have Gemini obviously in the UK in the same way that we do in the US, but you dumping the transcript into there and then seeing what are the key points that I could maybe talk about. And the key thing to remember is this is very much not an advanced tool in terms of like your journalistic nous, and it's important that you always keep that, I think, at your core and trust your judgment more, but it is useful almost as a little bit of a researcher.
I just quickly wanted to talk about two other things, again, in the research aspect that I often use. There's another tool called Elicit AI, again, expanding the capabilities of generative AI. What it's able to do, Elicit specifically focuses on academic research articles. So it's articles, papers that you would be finding on Google Scholar. If you go and ask it a question about how is AI maybe helping productivity, and like all of these papers are coming out and studies on whether AI is helping workers or not. If you go and ask it, it will summarize all of the scholarly papers that are out there, and it will summarize how the methodology was, what the insights were, the summary, and the results. And just at a glance, you can scan through multiple different papers and see the summary and everything, and see whether you want to read that paper. And just by looking at the method of the study, you know whether this is something that was valid or not. And again, it's summarizing based on that paper, and Elicit is something that I use a lot to help. And then there's also one more tool that I want to talk about in terms of the data aspects, again, in the research part of journalism. You're trying to deep dive into multiple data sets that are out there, and as a freelance journalist, you don't have the capacity of being in-house and having a data person there with you to help you out. But there are also now tools. There's something called Wobby AI, WOBBY.ai. It's a Belgian startup built by data journalists, and what they are working on, and which I find very useful, is they are currently, especially for European countries, connected to all the open data in their government, and they are constantly pulling that data and trying to generate insights that are there. And one thing that you can do as a journalist is go in and start chatting with this data and figure things out. You'll obviously, before publishing, there are certain times where things can go wrong and it can make stuff up. You need somebody to double check all of the work, but this gets you to that next point of like generating leads, and you can follow the story.
Thank you. I'm hating to have to cut this conversation short because I'm loving it, but I really want to go to some questions from the audience. So if you've got any questions for the panelist, lady over here in the pink jumper.
Thank you. Full disclosure, I'm not a journalist. I am a freelancer. I'm a translator and used to be one of the interpreters of the Journalism Festival. As a translator in written translation, we have used some sort of AI for a long time, like prompts. But I find that although sometimes it is in the right ballpark, it's not quite right. And if you really want to get it right, redoing it is faster than correcting it. I was wondering whether you have the same experience and how you have possibly, hopefully, solved the conundrum of not wanting to sound like a Luddite, but it just it's not quite right, as I said. It can actually create misunderstandings, dangerous misunderstandings, because it's accurate enough to generate relative confidence, but it's not accurate enough to be safe to use. For us in translations, it works. For technical manuals, it really works a charm, helps a lot with vocabulary. But if you need style and the intention of the speaker, of the author, it's not right.
Yeah.
I think Chris wants to take that.
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting points to that. One is I'm aware that we're sat in front of a thing that says the International Journalism Festival, and so we need to be aware that this is an international thing. And I in the book I have a lot of points on this, because actually there's a really interesting bit of research out by the Center for Democracy and Technology in the US, where they looked at kind of the training data or the languages that tend to be spoken on the internet and therefore have been kind of subsumed into these LLMs and the risks of a lack of representation. So you mentioned the technical language is often very good, and that's in part because the majority of the language on the internet is English, and the non-English language that is on there tends to be drawn from sort of official databases of patent applications or something like that. So if you want an LLM to tell you something in German, it will be brilliant at telling you, the fine-tuning of a clock mechanism, but it might not, as you say, be able to do the kind of poetic elements of it. I've spoken to a lot of people who have, unfortunately kind of had their jobs displaced, and I think that's one of the interesting things. You kind of raised this point of the inherent friction, I think, in being a freelancer, which is we know we have to adopt these bits of technology, and we know that they might be useful, but also it takes a lot of time in order to see whether or not they are or not. And so while Anna's using it for like bookkeeping and invoicing, or trying to, I have tried that, but it would take way more time for me personally because of my own work situation, where there are lots of different clients with lots of different formats of how they invoice. So I haven't managed to make an AI system interface, for instance, with like the BBC's freelancer portal or whatever it is that wouldn't work. So it is challenging. I think that's one of the things that we have to be aware of, is it takes a lot of mental effort to actually do this as well. And sometimes it is just better to blast through and do what you've always been doing.
And just to add on to that point, I don't think you have to use AI just for the sake of using AI. Just because it's out there doesn't mean we have to be doing it for every specific task. And sometimes there's actually a study that was done last year with the Boston Consulting Group and Harvard Business School. They had taken over 700 of their employees worldwide, their consultants, given and did a control study. One group had access to GPT-4 and they were trained on how to use it. The other group did not have access to it. And they compared the performance and productivity. The group that had access to GPT-4 was able to produce almost 40% more work than the group that did not have. They were more productive and efficient. And then they they went further and saw difference between the high performers and the low performers, and how much it increased work for them, improved work. And in fact, it improved for the work for the low performers, brought them up to the level of the high performers, and it did not help the high performers as much. So that's where, again, if you are a knowledge expert, if you are an expert in doing certain things and you're an expert in translation, you'll be able to do it maybe better than the model, and it's not going to be able to help you for that specific task. It might help you for other tasks where you're not that great, but if you're in a low performer in a particular category of work, that's where it could boost your productivity. And that's something that was there in the study there.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more quick question, but please keep it short because I don't want to get told off if I overrun. Okay.
Hi, I have a question about disclosure, disclosing when you've used these tools or not used them. if you covered this at the beginning, forgive me, I came in a few minutes late, but some newsrooms have policies saying, oh, you can't use AI tools. So if you do use these tools, let's say in the research process, or you use Elicit to find scholarly articles and summarize them, or maybe you write a draft and use it to proofread it, how do you think about disclosing that? And if you do disclose it, does that taint your work, or is there a perception that it's not permissible in the journalism industry?
I would almost flip that and say that that's on the publishers to figure out how they work with their freelancers, because that's putting the onus on the freelancer sticking their hand up, and it's going to catch them out whatever they do. It's wrong if I don't tell you that I've run it through, I use Grammarly, for example, which now increasingly is AI powered. Do I need to disclose that I've had spell check? And then if I don't tell them, am I going to somehow be kind of in sort of violation of policies? I mean, I think a point that all of us on the panel had discussed before we came on here and we didn't get a chance to make is that something that I've really noticed in the AI conversations that have been happening, on the other panels, they're very, very important conversations. They're always at the level of what the policy is, then what the publisher is, then what the newsrooms are. The freelancers are at the very bottom if being thought about at all. And that's kind of like what happens everywhere else in this industry. The freelancers who are the backbone of it and whose invisible hands are everywhere, they don't get thought about in any of these conversations. I think it's really important going forward is that any policy that newsrooms write, which are predominantly for their staffers, the freelancers there needs to be an active how does this apply to our freelancers? Because it can't be the case that freelancers then are not going to be able to use these tools because they need them for efficiency. But I completely take your point that, we have to draw the line. Of course, there are ethics. But I would really push that onto the publishers for them to figure out in a way that's really fair for the freelancers.
Thank you so much. I think is that all we've got time for?
If you want to do the last one, we can
do another question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Really
one more
quick.
question then.
Really quick.
A really quick one for Nikita, and it's subjective, but if you do this brainstorming conversation, do you feel that it's ethical? Because using it for admin purposes feels totally legit. But if you are producing the ideas talking to the machine, do you think it's ethical?
What about that, just to understand more, what about that do you find is tough?
Well, it goes into the realm of ideas, into the creative realm already. Mm-hmm. So what do you think? Do you think it's okay?
I mean, I see it as a tool of I have a bunch of experts and mentors and people that I go to and I brainstorm with them. This is another thing, a machine. I don't want to be able to give it that life, but it's a machine that is, again, boosting creativity. There are sometimes what a lot of people tell me, and also the name Newsroom Robots, we were sitting and my team was brainstorming with actually ideas that we could come up with the podcast titles. This was last year. This was with GPT 3.5. And there was something that came out, something really like robot reporter or something. And then we were like, no, we don't want that. We're not going to have a robot reporter. And then we were like, okay, we want the name robot. And then Newsroom Robots came out of that. And it was a brainstorming companion for us. And we were going with something like just AI and journalism and a boring name over there. And that's how Newsroom Robots came out. Because my team was doing that. This is just not me. A lot of newsrooms have been using it for podcast titles. They don't just use it to get the title. They use it to have multiple different ideas that you can have a conversation with your team afterwards. For me, I think as long as that human input is there, we are making the judgment at the end of the day. We are making the call at the end of the day. This is just another aspect in the team that's giving us all of these ideas that we can then put out there and go from. And in that case, for me, I find that completely, it's a new way of working, and it's something that's going to give you another boost of productivity, creativity. I'm able to do a lot more tasks right now that I wasn't doing last year, and I wasn't able to do last year. That's because I've been going to ChatGPT, understanding how do you go and teach a completely non-technical audience something very technical and break those things down? What are the different analogies with which I can teach? I'm a data scientist. I usually speak to people who are in the tech industry, and I have to break things down now for journalists. And so all of those different aspects, those are things that ChatGPT, because of the way it has been trained, it's able to produce that information and help you dissect that out and be another brainstorming partner there.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I just want to say Chris's book, How AI Ate the World, is out in 3 weeks, available at all good bookshops. Nikita's Newsroom Robots has an AI training course coming out shortly, right?
Yes, Newsroom Robots Academy
Newsroom
we're
Robots.
launching, self-guided pathways for you to learn AI.
And Anna has a fantastic newsletter that you should all sign up for. In the meantime, give us all a big round of applause. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.